Chicago, fall 2005. The chill of the evening clung to George's coat as he stepped out of the cab and stood for a moment in front of his modest two-story suburban house. He had been gone for weeks, confined to a hospital bed, tubes in his arms and monitors keeping track of every heartbeat. All he wanted now was the comfort of home, the familiar creak of the wooden steps, the smell of old books in the living room. But when he pushed open the door and stepped inside, his eyes froze on the sight in the hallway. Two large suitcases stood neatly by the door. His suitcases. The ones he hadn't touched in years, now packed tight, zippers drawn all the way, like soldiers at attention waiting for orders. For a moment he thought maybe it was some mistake. Maybe the wrong luggage, maybe some mix-up. But then he recognized the scuffed leather handle, the faded airline tag from a trip decades ago. They weren't anyone's bags. They were his. And inside he could already sense were his clothes, his belongings, his life folded and stuffed into compartments. The shock hit him first, then the anger. His heart, still weak from weeks of treatment, thudded harder than it should have. Was this it? Was his daughter Emily truly throwing him out? After everything, after raising her, after burying her mother, after dragging himself back from the edge in that sterile hospital, was this his reward? Suitcases by the door like he was nothing more than a tenant overstaying his welcome. The thought clawed at his chest, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He stepped deeper into the hallway, and the details only made his suspicion heavier. The house was spotless, unnervingly so. The bookshelf in the living room, usually scattered with newspapers and half-read magazines, now looked like a catalog picture. Every book lined perfectly, spines pressed against each other, not a single one tilted. His clothes, which normally lived in uneven piles on a chair in his bedroom, were gone. He knew instantly where they were, tucked into those suitcases, folded with a precision he would never bother with. In the kitchen, the table was wiped clean, no crumbs, no stains from coffee mugs. Even the old placemat he had used for years was missing. The refrigerator door, usually covered with magnets from gas stations and faded photographs, was bare white metal. It felt less like his home and more like a staged house someone was preparing to sell. And in a way, maybe that was exactly what it was. A house stripped of him. He touched the handle of one suitcase and felt the leather warm under his palm. The image that came to mind was grotesque. It wasn't a bag anymore, it was a coffin on wheels. All that was missing was someone to roll it out. He staggered back and sat heavily on the narrow bench near the door, staring at the luggage like it was a stranger. The silence of the house pressed down on him, and for the first time in years, it truly felt empty. The memories began flooding in, uninvited. Emily as a little girl, running down these stairs in her pajamas, calling his name. Emily as a teenager, slamming these same doors when they fought. Emily standing at her mother's funeral, stiff and pale, not shedding a tear while he barely held himself upright. Their lives had played out in this house, every scar of the past etched into its walls. And now, without a word, it seemed she was cutting him out of it. George tried to steady himself. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe Emily was organizing, tidying, overstepping like she always did. But no matter how he tried to rationalize, the sight of those packed bags was too final, too deliberate. Clothes folded like they were waiting for the trunk of a car, books boxed up as if already labeled for storage. This wasn't spring cleaning. This was eviction dressed up in neatness. He rose and walked through the rooms, searching for some sign that this was temporary. In his bedroom, the nightstand was stripped bare. No reading glasses, no dog-eared paperback. In the bathroom, only her towel hung on the rack. His old faded one was gone. Even the small photo of his wedding day, which always sat on the dresser, had vanished. It was as if someone had methodically erased him. The anger boiled higher. He felt betrayed, outmaneuvered, as though life had pulled a cruel trick while he was vulnerable. To spend weeks in a hospital, fighting to come back, only to return to a house that no longer seemed to want him, it was almost too much to bear. He clenched his fists, muttering under his breath, fighting the urge to shout even though no one else was there. The truth clawed at him, sharper with every step he took through the hollowed-out rooms. His relationship with Emily had been frayed for years, but never had he imagined it could reach this point. They had argued, yes. He had been strict, harsh at times, and she never forgave easily. But this? To pack up his life behind his back? It was unthinkable. When he returned to the hallway, the suitcases were still there, silent and accusing. He lowered himself onto the bench again, the weight of his body pulling him down like a stone in water. For the first time, he felt something heavier than anger or suspicion. He felt helpless. The house, once his fortress, now whispered that he didn't belong. And as he sat there, staring at those bags, He realized he was no longer sure what he would find when Emily came home, an explanation or the confirmation of his worst fear. The front door creaked again and George stiffened on the bench. The sound of footsteps, light but steady, moved across the hallway. Emily appeared, her shoulders squared, her hair pulled back neatly, the kind of posture that told him she wasn't caught off guard. She looked calm, too calm, as if she had already rehearsed this moment. She set down her purse on the kitchen counter and glanced toward the suitcases without surprise. That glance confirmed his suspicion. This wasn't some accident. She knew and she had planned for it. George rose unsteadily, his voice already breaking with accusation. He pointed at the luggage, his hand trembling. He demanded to know what this meant. What kind of daughter came home from work and left her father's belongings packed like he was a guest whose stay had expired? Emily didn't flinch. She stood there, composed, and in a level voice told him not to overreact. "I'm doing this for you," she said, as if the explanation were obvious. For him, those words struck like another blow. For him? Was she serious? He barked back that he had come home to rest, to heal, and instead he found his life stacked by the door. Emily countered that the hospital had made it clear he needed care, routine, order, things she couldn't always give while working full-time and managing everything else. She said the bags were part of a plan, but she avoided going into detail. To George it sounded like betrayal wrapped in polite reasoning. The conversation dragged them both into old wounds, places neither wanted to revisit but neither could avoid. Emily brought up his temper when she was young, the way he barked orders like he was still on a construction site. George defended himself with the same lines he had used for decades, that he had worked himself to the bone so she could have a roof over her head, so she could go to school, so there would always be food on the table. But the more he said it, the more it sounded hollow even to him. Emily reminded him of nights he never came home, of mornings when she ate cereal alone because he had already left for the job. She remembered waiting for him at school events, only to be told he was stuck on a project. The house seemed to shrink as their words clashed. The spotless kitchen, which looked almost staged, now became the battleground of their history. George gripped the edge of the counter for balance, his chest tightening with each accusation. Emily leaned back against the refrigerator, arms crossed, her expression steady but her jaw tense. It was clear she wasn't here to argue for the sake of it, she had made up her mind. Just then the side door swung open with the faint squeak of its loose hinge. Mrs. Johnson, their elderly neighbor, shuffled in holding a mug like she had come to borrow sugar, though everyone knew she always came when voices rose. Her gray hair was pinned loosely, and her eyes darted straight to the suitcases. She muttered something about hearing noise, then settled herself at the edge of the table without waiting for an invitation. George nearly exploded. He didn't want an audience for this humiliation, especially not from the neighborhood gossip. But Emily didn't chase the woman out. Instead, she poured her a bit of coffee as if this intrusion was routine. Mrs. Johnson sipped and nodded like she was watching a television drama unfold. Every so often, she added her thoughts, "Kids these days, they don't respect their parents," followed by, "Well then again, parents didn't always know how to listen either." Each comment stung George as if the old woman were poking at wounds that hadn't even stopped bleeding. Emily remained unmoved, her calmness bordering on infuriating. She repeated again that the decisions she made weren't about pushing him out but about taking care of things he refused to face. George heard only one thing, that his daughter had turned his own home into a place where he had no control. The fact that Mrs. Johnson nodded, sometimes at Emily's words, sometimes at his, only made the air heavier. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence between arguments. George's anger was a storm, but beneath it, fear settled like lead. He was beginning to believe what the scene suggested, that Emily, his only daughter still close by, had indeed decided life would be easier without him under this roof. He sat heavily at the table, glaring at the suitcases visible in the doorway, while Emily stood nearby, her figure unshaken as if she were already bracing for the next battle. The room pulsed with tension, the kind that made even Mrs. Johnson lower her voice to a whisper. To George, it felt less like a family home and more like a courtroom with his daughter as the prosecutor, his neighbor as the smug witness, and himself in the chair of the accused. And in that moment, surrounded by silence, the certainty hardened in his chest. Emily wasn't just tidying up. She was planning a future without him in it. George sat at the kitchen table, staring past Emily and the nosy neighbor, his mind pulling him backward into memories he had tried for years to bury. The smell of the hospital still clung to him, but it was the memory of another sterile room that haunted him most, the one where Margaret had taken her last breath. His wife had been gone for almost a decade now, struck down by a sudden heart attack that no one saw coming. He remembered the night clearly, how the paramedics carried her out while Emily stood pale and silent by the door. From that night onward, something between him and his daughter had cracked, and it had never healed. In the years after Margaret's death, George had thrown himself deeper into work, building houses for other families while his own family crumbled. He came home late, too tired to talk, too exhausted to notice that Emily was slipping away into her own silence. He convinced himself that providing a paycheck was enough, that keeping the lights on and food on the table was the measure of a good father. But every time Emily looked at him across the dinner table, there was something in her eyes, resentment, maybe fear, that told him she wanted more than money. Michael was different. His son was softer, more patient, the kind of boy who never argued. After college, he left for New York, chasing a career that quickly consumed him. The phone calls that once came every Sunday dwindled to once a month, then only on birthdays and holidays. Now George was lucky to get a text on Christmas. He blamed Michael's city life, his job, his fast-paced world. But in quiet moments he wondered if maybe his son had simply escaped, put as many miles between them as possible, and never looked back. The silence in the kitchen grew heavier until Emily's voice cut through it, sharp and steady. She said he had ruled the house with fear, that every word he spoke carried the threat of anger. "You kept us in fear, Dad. You thought being a man meant you could do anything you wanted." Her words hung in the air, impossible to dismiss. George wanted to protest, to remind her of the roof over her head, the meals on the table, the clothes she wore. But he also remembered the nights he shouted at her for staying out late, the mornings he barked at Michael for some small mistake, the way his voice filled the house not with warmth but with command. To him, those moments had been discipline, the way his own father had raised him. He had believed a house needed rules, a family needed structure. But hearing Emily's voice now, steady and calm, made him see it differently. Perhaps what he called structure had been nothing more than intimidation. Perhaps the order he demanded had smothered the very people he thought he was protecting. The image of himself as a strict provider twisted now into something darker, a tyrant who mistook control for love. Yet still, the bags by the door reminded him that he wasn't just the villain in this story. He was also the man being pushed out of his own home, stripped of his place in the life he built. He felt like both the victim and the executioner at once, and the contradiction gnawed at him. The house bore the marks of his labor, the very walls built and repaired by his hands, and yet he sat here being told he had no claim to its warmth anymore. His mind wandered to the hospital again, not the most recent stay but another one years ago. He remembered a blur of paperwork, a notary, Emily's hand guiding a pen into his. He had been weak then, groggy from medication, barely paying attention to the words on the page. He recalled someone saying it was just to make things easier, to ensure bills were paid, to avoid inheritance fights down the line. He hadn't thought twice. Now the memory unsettled him. He couldn't remember exactly what he signed, but the thought made his stomach turn. Had he already given away more than he realized? The ticking of the clock on the wall felt louder than before. Mrs. Johnson slurped her coffee, watching with the detached interest of a neighbor who knew every secret but never missed a chance to add her commentary. George didn't care what she thought. His eyes stayed locked on Emily, searching for something, remorse, hesitation, anything that hinted she hadn't written him off completely. But her face was calm, as if she had already decided everything. The weight of the years pressed on him. Margaret's absence, Michael's distance, Emily's accusations, they all collapsed onto his shoulders at once. He felt the fury of a man betrayed, but also the guilt of a father who knew deep down that his daughter's words weren't entirely wrong. And as his mind circled back to that blurred signature on hospital paperwork, he realized there might be more truth to his helplessness than even he dared admit. Emily finally moved away from the refrigerator, her calmness unwavering, and walked down the hallway. George heard the faint scrape of a drawer opening, then the sound of paper being pulled from a folder. She returned with a thick manila envelope and placed it firmly on the kitchen table between them. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable. "You should see this," she said simply, sliding the folder toward him. George hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of him. Inside were photocopies, stamped and signed, with his own name in black ink sprawled across the bottom lines. His breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was looking at. The deed to the house. His house. Only it no longer belonged to him. The papers showed clearly that he had transferred ownership to Emily 4 years earlier, while he had been in the hospital. His own signature, shaky but undeniable, stared back at him like an accusation. It felt like the floor beneath him had shifted. For years he had carried himself as the master of this house, The one who had poured his sweat into every corner, who had built the deck with his bare hands, who had fixed the roof one summer when the shingles curled from heat. And now he saw in black and white that legally, this place hadn't been his for a long time. He had been living under an illusion, clinging to an ownership he no longer had. The realization knocked the air out of his lungs. The memory came rushing back in fragments. He had been weak, recovering from surgery, drifting in and out of sleep. A man in a suit, some notary or lawyer he couldn't recall, had appeared with forms. Emily had sat at his bedside, urging him gently to sign, saying it was just to make sure things were easier in case something happened. She had told him it would save headaches later, avoid disputes, keep the government from taking too big a bite. At the time, in his fog, he believed her. He scribbled his name where she pointed and closed his eyes, relieved when the conversation ended. He never thought about it again. Until now. His throat tightened as he looked up at her. She wasn't gloating, wasn't smirking. She only watched him carefully, as though waiting for him to finally realize what she had known all along. "You signed it," she said quietly. "It wasn't a trick. You agreed." Her voice wasn't cruel, but the finality in it stung more than if she had shouted. George wanted to lash out, to accuse her of taking advantage when he was weak. But the truth gnawed at him. He had indeed signed. He had chosen trust over caution. He had let her guide his hand, believing it was in his best interest. And now the trust he once gave so easily tasted bitter in his mouth. The silence in the room grew thick until Mrs. Johnson, never one to let silence linger, chimed in from her spot at the table. She sipped from her mug, her eyes glinting with curiosity. "Well, let's not be too hard on her," she said, her tone casual but cutting. "She didn't do it for herself, you know. Emily's not the type. She was thinking ahead for the family, for you." George whipped his head toward her, suspicion flaring. For the family? For him? If not for Emily, then for who? For Michael, the son who called only when it suited him? For some future arrangement he hadn't been told about? His stomach churned with unease. The idea that Emily had done all this not for her own sake but for some broader plan left him more unsettled than before. Emily didn't confirm or deny Mrs. Johnson's remark. She simply stayed quiet, letting the words hang in the air. That silence was worse than any explanation. It made George feel as if everyone else knew the truth except him, as if he were the last person to be trusted with his own life. The room seemed smaller, the walls pressing in. George felt cornered, exposed. He was both furious at Emily and ashamed of himself for letting it happen. The papers sat on the table like a verdict, undeniable and final. The neighbor's sly half-smile only deepened the sense that this was no longer his home, no longer his fight to win. The atmosphere thickened as if the house itself was holding its breath. George couldn't decide whether he was the betrayed or the betrayer, whether Emily's actions were ruthless or protective. He only knew that nothing would ever feel certain again. The truth in the papers had rewritten his past without him noticing, and now his future seemed like a question with no safe answer. George sat slumped at the table, the papers still open in front of him like a mirror showing a face he no longer recognized. His chest felt heavy, but not from the weak heart the doctors worried about. It was the weight of realization, the sense that life had been moving in one direction while he thought it was heading in another. He had seen betrayal in every corner of this house tonight, in the suitcases, in his daughter's eyes, in his own signature inked years ago. And yet, as Emily finally spoke again, her voice broke through with a calm he hadn't expected. She told him the truth at last. The bags were not meant to send him into the street or to erase him from the home. They were packed to take him to a facility she had been saving for, a place she had visited quietly without telling him. It wasn't some cold warehouse for the forgotten, but a private rehabilitation center filled with doctors and therapists. A place where he would be watched, cared for, and given the chance to recover in a way she knew she couldn't manage alone. She admitted she hadn't told him earlier because she was afraid of his temper, afraid of the accusations that would come before he even heard her reasoning. The words stung not because they were cruel but because they rang true. He pictured himself coming home weeks earlier, still fragile from the hospital, refusing every suggestion, lashing out at every reminder of weakness. He knew how quickly his voice could rise, how easily he turned fear into fury. Emily had chosen silence, had chosen to act instead of argue, because in her mind it was the only way forward. The suitcases were never a verdict, only a plan. George leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the hallway where the bags still stood, zipped and waiting. They no longer looked like coffins to him. They looked like tools of transition, heavy and awkward but maybe necessary. The sharp edge of anger dulled as another truth sank in. Emily had not betrayed him. She had protected him in the only way she knew how, firmly, practically, without sentiment. Her method might have lacked warmth, but it carried a kind of love he had been too blind to see. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking clock. Even Mrs. Johnson, so eager with her commentary, had gone quiet, sensing the air had shifted. George thought of Margaret then, his late wife, and wondered what she would say if she were here. He imagined her telling him to stop fighting ghosts, to see the daughter not as an enemy but as the only person still willing to stand by him when others had drifted away. Michael had his life in New York, too busy to come home for more than a holiday dinner. Emily was the one who remained, shouldering the burden. The anger drained, replaced by something more painful, regret. Regret for the nights he had been too harsh, for the years of silence after Margaret's death, for the way he had treated Emily as a subordinate instead of a daughter. He realized the real betrayal was not the luggage or the papers. The real betrayal had been his silence, his failure to say the words that mattered when there was still time. He pushed the folder aside and spoke, his voice low but steady. He said, "Betrayal isn't always about suitcases by the door. Sometimes it's the years of silence when we don't say we love each other. Everything else is just consequences." His words hung in the kitchen like smoke, heavy and lingering, reaching both his daughter and himself. Emily didn't answer. She turned her face away, and he thought he saw the faint shine of tears in her eyes. But whether those tears were relief, guilt, or exhaustion he couldn't tell. She walked to the sink, busying herself with a glass of water, as if avoiding the weight of his words. Mrs. Johnson muttered something about needing to feed her cat and shuffled toward the back door, leaving father and daughter alone. George stayed seated, staring at the suitcases. They no longer terrified him, but they still unsettled him. He wondered if he would go with her to that place, wondered if he could let go of the stubborn pride that had kept him tied to this house. The decision wasn't made yet, not fully. The night ended not with answers but with possibilities. As the kitchen dimmed in the fading evening light, George realized this chapter of his life had closed. What came next would depend not just on Emily's plans, but on his willingness to accept them. Whether they would truly reconcile or drift even further apart, he couldn't know. The story, like the bags by the door, remained unfinished, waiting for the next step that only they could decide. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.